I contemplated the green fields of heaven and the sickle of the new moon. I remembered all that I had sown and the season of harvest soon. Don't take this moment of friendship for granted. In the front door, out the back, then to meet again, no more. In the garden of ecstasy, I am the watchman of the heart's shrine tonight, all night long. The night of separation is gone. The welcome scent of unity has arrived. What a wonderful morning after such a wonderful night. No surprise if in Seventh Heaven, lyrics composed by Hafez and sung by Venus entice Jesus to dance. In the time of Adam, in the Garden of Paradise, the poetry of Hafez ornamented the diaries of the wild lilacs and the amaryllis. In this garden, white-haired, Hafez prays to God. Let me sit again by a stream with a lovely tall cypress by my side. Make my coffin of cypress. Words often come before or after the experience. After some of his own words to introduce you to Hafez, I'll now provide some afterwords. As to Hafez's actual life story, we know amazingly little. Indeed, it is so riddled with unsourced conjecture and fabulous legends such as his verbal life or death duel with Tamerlane. A historiography would be well worth the candle. He left little trace but for his lyrics and calligraphy, but his poetry isn't confessional, although there are readers who love trying to link his lyrics to his life, reminding me of how some like to listen to classical music as being programmatic. Now the composer is thinking of his wife, now the composer has spilled some ink, now the composer is thinking of breakfast. There's a website, Ganjoor, GANJOOR.net/Hafez, where every one of his poems has extensive commentary by readers telling you what the commas mean, and everybody's interpretation, just this fabulous kind of thing. And you can also hear singing of each one, sometimes 2 or 3 versions. I'll read you a little from, we have time? Yeah, okay. I'll read you a little about the profile that we did like a dozen pages. I'll read you 2. And I think the most important thing is that if you go to a home in Iran today, you're likely to find on a bookshelf 2 books. One is a Quran, and one is the complete works of Hafez, well dog-eared, memorized. As people commonly not only quote lines to each other in everyday life, but play games, especially like on Yalda. This poem ends in this word, you have to come up with a new line that begins with that word. I mean, I think Iran is a bardic culture, where people quote poetry in everyday life. I think back in his time to today. There's a wonderful book by Iraj Paraksad, I think his name is, called Hafez in Love, where he has to go underground because he's written a poem about his patron, about his patron's poetry, saying his patron's poetry isn't really that good. So he has to go underground. And throughout the book, everybody's quoting Sadi and Rumi, and he comes at the point which sort of like he knew all the poets before him and the poets of his day. And he was able to kind of match every one. Anyway, back to the book. His dates are possibly 1315 to 1390 or 791 age. It's not absolutely certain, but note that Muslims of his time didn't celebrate birthdays. It's safe to say Hafez was a contemporary of Chaucer, yet Hafez is more like Shakespeare 2 centuries later. Both were immersed in cosmopolitan as well as local culture. Their affinity might even bear direct influence. Scholar of the Boston Museum of Art, Ernest Fenollosa, points out that the, quote, freedom of the Elizabethan mind and its power to range over all planes of human experience, as in Shakespeare, was in part an aftermath of Oriental contacts, in contacts with Iran included. We often call him Ḥāfeẓ-e Shīrāzī. He was a native of Shiraz, the capital of the province of Fars, from which come the words Farsi and Persian. Throughout the Islamic world for centuries, Shiraz had been considered as the house of knowledge, comparable to the Athens of Iran. Situated for both land and maritime trade on the Silk Road and the spice routes, it was a major international trading center, and as a regional political center, its economy was self-reliant. In Hafez's time, Shiraz was comparable to Florence under the de Medicis. And within that background of artistic and intellectual brilliance, Hafez's grasp of the philosophies, poetics, and politics of his time provided solid, rich grounding for him to reach beyond any other Persian poet. Media studies students take note. It took centuries for Dante to become known in Europe. The manuscripts were hand done and chained to the monastery. And a monk had to make an appointment to make a pilgrimage to a monastery, to make a copy, to take it back to his monastery, to be chained. But Hafez's lyrics were lyrics meant to be sung. So people would print a couple up of his new ones, and wandering troubadours would go out and sing them so other people could hear them and they could sing them. So that within his lifetime, he was not only known all over the Persian Empire, but in the Persian communities in India, Turkestan, and Mesopotamia. I'll read just one more paragraph. Someone suggested he gather his lyrics together, which is this Persian practice of collecting and publishing a poet's works into a book, divan, in his or her lifetime, but no. His gaze seemed to know no reverse except to further refine and polish his work. His refusal to commit to a divan meant his work remained to be collected and arranged by others a dozen years after his death. His poems are dated, although some refer to contemporary events. But divans aren't typically arranged chronologically, nor even thematically, but rather by the syllables rhyming at the ends of lines. What's important to note here is that Hafez's collected work, some 500 poems, is half or a third less than his peers. This reflects the soul-digging, hard-working commitment to craft, seen in each lyric's high degree of polish. His pen name, Hafez, refers to one who has memorized the Holy Quran. It could also imply one who memorizes songs, a minstrel, a master singer, and someone who knows something. It might also mean one who remembers, one who preserves, protects, as heard in the common phrase, Khoda Hafez, may God be your protector. This skill was his day job for courtly patrons. In an epoch in which the vastness of the Persian Empire was being relentlessly whittled away, he lived under 5 rulers, none of whom came to a natural end. Okay, so having melded our preface and afterwords together, texts and contexts, I'd like to share a little more, such as about ambiguity and translation, plus a word on divination, and then save it for Q&A. Art reflects its times, right? Living in an autocratic single ruler system, ambiguity becomes an everyday survival tactic on up to Iran today. We can see ambiguity in Hafez in a number of ways. One, linguistically, pronouns in Farsi are indeterminate as to whether she or he is signified. When it's a wine server, we assume it's a male. Generally, though, Liz and Iraj, as I read, opted for he rather than the typical she. We opted for you, as in me and you, I and thou. Question: could contemporary terms of gender bending and non-binary apply? No. Ambiguity has greater significance when Hafez refers to the beloved. It might mean A, a mortal human with a zip code, B, the eternal divine source of creation, the EDSC, or both. This conflation can be readily seen in Shīrāzī, the Song of Songs, and in Christian conceptions of the bride of Christ. In Hafez, as scholar Hamid Dabashi puts it, the two mirror and magnify each other with catalytic effect. In my own minority interpretation of this, I consider this phenomenon of the mirroring and magnifying as including the panegyric, poems in praise of the leader, the ruler, addressed as the beloved. This interpretation can be extended to include the soul of the world, both the existential, rectilinear, discursive world, and the more circular, non-discursive, brighter world we know is possible. If I may, I wish to explore the craft of translation a little further. Beside the local specificity of Persian words, there are larger issues of untranslatable, as illumined by translator Dick Davis in his essay on not translating Hafez, which will be linked in the Google Doc when I get back. But it's curious how the universality of Basho, Blake, Cervantes, etc. is coterminous with their deep rootedness in their local language and cultural soil. Personally, I'd love to learn more about the role of the image in Persian and Arabic poetry. In Islam, as in Judaism, idolatry is taboo. When Hafez evokes an eagle of oppression, is it to be visualized or taken as a symbol of an inconceivable vastness? Contrast the impact of image in Basho, Little Pond, Frog Jumps In, say, where in the words of Imagist poet Dr. William Carlos Williams, there are no ideas but in things, with Hafez, where there are no things or images but in ideas or feelings. So the Imagist school was like following China and Japan, they called it Imagism, and then a later school with Jerome Rothenberg, Robert Kelly, Robert Bly, were considering the deep image. And Hafez is the deepest. A more general question in translation is foreignization of words and syntax. Sometimes we use the foreign word entering it into our glossary, other times we paraphrased it. But there's another perspective where we can see how Hafez has mattered, which I'll spotlight in a quick rendition of a lineage of Hafez translation in the West, between these two doors, this caravan. The reading of Hafez in German translation by the champion of Weltliterature, world literature, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, helped inspire his own influential West Eastern Divan, quite recently retranslated with his notes and essays on Persian poets. And the caravan moves on, carrying Goethe's leanings toward the East to Friedrich Nietzsche, as seen, say, in his contending with the Dionysian, and other themes. Nietzsche mentions Hafez 10 times. And the caravan crosses the Atlantic. Uh-oh. We know Emerson's affinity with Goethe, so we naturally find the influence of Hafez on Ralph Waldo Emerson, notably in his important poem Bacchus. The influence of Emerson on his contemporary Emily Dickinson is known. Think, for example, of her poem, I tasted a liquor never brewed. Now we come to the, more problematic issues. The first is translation by people who don't know the source language, like me. I work with a native speaker, and our book was vetted by Elizabeth and Raj. Certain translators, such as Ezra Pound, Kenneth Rexroth, Robert Bly, Stephen Mitchell, translate, having read somebody else's translation from another era. For a decade, if you're not aware, almost the most commercially popular poet in America was Rumi, in translation by Coleman Barks, great poet, signaling that revival of devotional poetry that I referred to earlier. These translations of Rumi sold over 2 million copies. Like his mentor Robert Bly, Coleman began using earlier translations as a springboard. And then we come to cultural erasure. In her book, Citizen, by African-American author Claudia Rankine, She gives us an emblematic example. As she waits in a grocery store checkout line, a white cashier fails to recognize her as a customer and instead directs his attention to the white man behind her, asking if he is ready despite her being closer to the counter and having items waiting to be scanned. And she's, like used to this, and she says, I think, that's okay, I'm not in a hurry. And the cashier says, I don't see you. He didn't say, I didn't see you. He says, I don't see you. So, over 1 million people now know the name Hafez through the work of a disciple of Meir Baba named Daniel Ladinsky. Yet, the poetry of the English speakers know as being by Hafez are really by Daniel Ladinsky.